In this video I'm going to talk about how to remove the gear set from the transmission. I'll initially talk about how the thing is put in here and what connection points are, and then I'll go through the process of removing it. It's really not such a big deal. The assumption is at this stage that the rear cover has been removed, and you remove the iTrix, including the distance sensor and the input speed sensors. I'll also show you the tools that I made that helped me get the job done. So the way this thing is put in, like at the back here where it's pressed into some sealed bearings, there is also a single sealed bearing at the front, which is the same as the one that's on here. It's exactly the same spec. And whilst this one is holding on to the center of the two input shafts, the one at the front holds onto the outer of the two input shafts. So they are the thrust bearings for each of those two shafts. And we'll have to push that out as the last thing that we do. There are two support structures that hold on to all the bits inside the transmission. You can see one here, and there's another one about 2 inches below that. They are held in from the top, as well as some positions around the side here. So we need to remove those. And then once that's done, a few other things that we need to do, then the whole thing can get pushed out. First thing I'm going to do is remove this pipe here. It's normally held in position by the distance sensor that sits there, and it feeds oil from the lubrication gallery into the center in here between the two input shafts. But you just pull that up. It's a long bit there and a short bit there, so it gets fed down a fair way down in there, and then you just line it up in there and then just push that into place. There is a little baby O-ring inside each of those points. Once I remove that pipe, I need to remove this baffle here, but what I want to do is remove this gear at the back. It just slides straight off on spline, so there are two washers. Note the orientation of those, because the skinnier one goes at the closest to the gear, and then that one will go on the end. That'll just pull straight off like that. And then there are two screws down here. They're M6 T30s. Remove those, and then this baffle just comes straight out. These screws are M6 8.8. Actually, that's a 10.9. So I'm going to put 13 Newton meters on that on the way in. Something to be aware of when you have removed the rear cover. The way this is all held together, this the input shaft here, there's this big sort of washer on the end here. That's pressed onto the shaft, so that can't move. But on this side here, there are a couple of washers that just come straight off. And then this gear can just come straight off, and then there's a sleeve, and then things can start to move. It's a bit hard for me to get my fingers in here, but you can see that start to move. And in addition, when that one starts to move, this one also underneath it will start to move. Let's see if I can move that up. There we go. What you need to be aware of is if, for example, I needed to flip this upside down because I was removing the gear set or I was doing work at the other end of the transmission, if I don't secure these gears, these will automatically just want to flop down. The problem with that is in here is all the synchro mesh. That's triple synchro mesh where there's multiple pins of everything that's sort of joined together in there, and if this, it only needs to move a couple of millimeters away from it, and then things start to turn, and all this synchro mesh will get out of sync, or it'll get out of alignment. And once it's like that, getting it back in there, if you don't really know what's going on here, is a complete nightmare. You might even end up having to just remove the gear set and completely disassemble all this end of it to try and sort everything out. So, in order to stop that happening, what I would do is I'd put that on there. I'd immediately just remove those gears from the top here if I was going to flip it over. Put that sleeve in place. I'm just going to put a hose clamp over the top of that, lock that in place so this cannot move, and now I can flip it upside down and none of this is going to fall apart. Also, something to be aware of, if you've got the cover off and the temptation, like I had, was to start moving these shifters back and forth just to see how everything works. My suggestion is not to do that, because you can get some of the synchro mesh pieces, because there's lots of little pieces. The struts in here have little balls and springs and stuff, and things can just start to pop out, and again you might end up having to disassemble the gear set to try and sort it all out. So my advice would be not to start playing with things. Connection points for this top support plate, there's one screw there, one screw there, and one screw in here. So these two just come straight out. This one here holds the shaft for the idler gear. So the way that comes out, I'm just going to put another screw in there. It's not going to fall out, but it just makes it a bit simpler if I just hold onto that. And with that screw removed, I can just lift that whole thing up. And I would do this as the first thing I did, because as soon as you start to remove some of the other screws, everything sort of moves a little bit, and this can get out of alignment and this shaft can become really tight. So I'd do this one first, and you're just going to pull that out. There's going to be a big washer, top and bottom. On that, there's going to be a bearing on the inside. Note the orientation of that gear so it goes back into the same spot. For the lower of the support structures, there are 4 connection points. There's this one here, there's one there, and there's 2 that go down. There's one that you can see there, and there's one on the other side here. They're a bit unusual, and this one here it's a 6mm thread, and you pull it out, and then there's a dowel, a really big wide dowel that uses a 10mm thread that we're going to pull out. This one here is a really big, long, hollow, funny structure. And it is the weep hole when you actually look at where everything goes from inside here, because you've got the 2 shafts, the inner and the outer, you've got a seal on the end of it and the bearing on the inside, and if it gets outside the seal, that's where that weeps to, that one there, but that needs to be removed, and the other 2 as well. This one is a 6mm Allen key. This one's a T45 Torx, which is what most of these are. And they're a really funny looking screw in that they've got this thing here, and then there's a seal on the outside of it. And to remove the dowel from here, you just need a decent bit of threaded 10mm bar. This one's obviously fairly long, you don't need something as long as this, but save me cutting a piece up. Just a piece of steel on the end of it. And that just pops out. And on the other side, we've got that one and that one that need to come off. That one is again one of those funny screws with the seal on the end. I think that one is M10, but they're both T45. And so with those 7 screws that come in from the outside of the top that hold onto these 2 support plates, that's all that needs to be done here. The only thing that needs to come off later, and this is after we press it out of the bearing at the front, is the park brake gear here. It's got a big circlip on it, it's very loose, but we can't pull it out at the moment because of this first gear. And the way this works is that once it's pushed, the shafts will be pulled out about maybe an inch or so, then we can unclip this and everything will come out, but I'll show you that later. Tools that I'm going to use to help me out, just some stands here. I've just got some 8mm threaded bar, and I've threaded that about so deep into these bits of timber, and they just go in here. I've just got some aluminium washers that I've just made up just to go there to protect the face of this. I've just chosen a couple of spots here, as well as one on the other side there, and that one I've used because obviously I'm now going to be able to pull it clear, but you need to look at that lower support structure. It needs to be sort of relatively narrow in that direction there so it can come clear when we remove that later on. Something to be careful of if you're making stands like these, and as you see I've just got that 8mm threaded bar. What I did with these, I just ground off some corners so I could screw that in just with a spanner. Problem is it deformed the threads a little bit, and the problem is when you put that into here, this stuff is so soft, it really surprises me how soft this aluminium alloy is. This just ground it away in a heartbeat. So be really careful with that. Your threads need to be perfect before you put them in here, otherwise you'll grind them away and you'll be helicoiling stuff before you know it. The stand that I've made for it when it's upside down is this thing. This is just a piece of M20 threaded bar. I've just put some holes in there. That's 87mm apart, which is exactly the distance there, and then that slots straight down into that. And the nice thing about having those nuts is I can adjust those so everything's at exactly the correct height. and later on I'm pushing it out, and this is going to be a little bit higher, I can have this so it can go down about that far and just fall straight down on this once everything gets pushed clear of the bearing at the front. To get access to these, because in the factory they put these circlips in here, there's a couple of funny ones. And this one here is on the input shaft, and it's because there's a big thread. I think this is M24 by 1.5. I still need to check. I think this one's M22 by 1.5. But this one here is at the bottom of the threads. It goes down about 1.5 centimeters or so. This one's pretty easy to remove because it'll be down there. You just get a screwdriver and just whack it with a mallet, and it'll go pop like that, and then you can just grab it and pull it out. This one here looks like it would be easy, and it's sitting at the top of the thread, like way up the top here, and I think that's so maybe when they're lifting in the factory they grab hold of this one rather than this one here as they're lifting the thing around. I don't know, because they don't really serve any other purpose. But you would think you just get your circlip pliers onto that, compress that, and it comes straight out. No, unfortunately not. That doesn't compress it enough. So you'll need to get in there and then just lever that out. That actually took a fair bit of time to get that thing out. But once you do that, then you have access to these two holes where we can then use a tool to sit this thing on. Things that need to be removed at the top. Once you turn the thing over, you'll have a big circlip which holds the shaft into the bearing down the bottom there. That's in pretty tightly, but you'll need to remove that. You'll have the 4 pistons that sit on the end of the shift rods. They take a T30. You just unscrew those. Normally the screw that's in the middle there will just come out with it. There's an O-ring that seals the screw to the piston itself, and then they just come straight out. If the screw just comes out by itself and leaves the piston inside, just get some flag tip pliers, open those out, and they just pull out and come out pretty easily. At the bottom here, these two, they'll have a baffle sitting over the top of it like that when you first pull off the intermediate plate. And that's just because of the way the oil is distributed for these straight from the valve body rather than via the intermediate plate in the front, so they just need to be a little bit deeper. But all you need to do is just get a little pick tool under there and just pull those out. They're just sealed by an O-ring around the outside. And so now with all that stuff disconnected, I can push the outer of the two shafts out of that bearing. The way I've got this set up is I'll put some extra bits of timber here, so this is supported, and now it's not actually being supported at the bottom of these. I've got a gap of about 20 millimeters because that's how far this thing will have to come out before it comes loose. And if it's like you need to adjust it later on, clearly that's going to be fairly easy. And with it set up like now I can just hammer on the outer of the two input shafts to whack that down, and it'll just catch and just sit there on the stand at the bottom. This is just a piece of aluminium pipe that fits nicely over the top of that. You're not going to do any damage to this. This steel is just so hard, it's kind of amazing, but certainly an aluminium pipe is not going to present any problems at all. All I can do now is just knock that out. There we go, now she comes. And once I've knocked that out, now the last thing I need to do is come in here and remove that circlip on the park brake gear and then just pull that out. And when you're lifting it up, the output shaft that goes to the pinion shaft, there's a big gear there that sort of gets in the way, so you just need to wiggle it a bit to lift it up and out. That actually came out quite friendly, but sometimes on the underside of the casing, when the gear set is removed, things you can see, there's obviously the pinion shaft. You can see that hex, which is where the gear oil pump slots into. I'm not going to remove this because I don't know how much torque is on this bolt, and there's a big bearing set underneath. And if you really needed to get access to that because that bearing was toast, I guess we'll learn on the job then, but I'm not going to take that thing out. The bearing here, you can see there's a bunch of screws here, exactly the same as the rear casing. That bearing is exactly the same bearing as the upper of the two rear bearings. When you're removing these T30, make sure you have a good bit. These strip pretty easily, so just be careful with that, take it nice and easy. They're M6 8.8, so they'd take, or I'd use 10 Newton meters on the way back in, and they had Loctite on them, so I would also be using Loctite. This bearing here for the output shaft, it clips into sort of a metal, sort of a thing on the other side. So if you want to remove that, you can just get a little pick tool underneath it and then just pull it up from both sides, because of the way that clip works. And when you're trying to push that back down, I would suggest using something that's going to keep it flat, because unless you push it down straight, it doesn't want to come in. The little clips on the other side will want to break. Also, you can see that's where that dowel was before, so I am going to install that thing now before I'm going to hammer that all the way into place before I install the gear set. You'll also notice that all 4 actuator cylinders are removed, because that's going to enable those shift rods to go in there much more easily when I install. For the gear set installation, I'm going to have all of these pushed out. They would normally be sitting inside there like that. They just push into place really easily. The O-ring that sits around there, that just gets pushed into there afterwards. But the problem is, if this is in place, it's a much smaller hole. All the shift rods aren't going to be perfectly aligned. They get aligned after they get put through this hole. And if these are in, it's easy to, it's really hard to get them through this small hole here. But also what can happen is it can push through and actually dislodge the seal that's inside here. So my suggestion would be, once you remove the gear set, knock all these out from the other side, which is really simple. And then once the gear set is back in place, then we can go and install these. To remove the plastic cylinders for the shift rods, they're easily just knocked out from this side. You just need something that's just the right size to slot down there. My 17mm socket just works perfectly, and they just pop out the bottom. A couple of things about the gear set for installation. The dowel that we knocked out came from that position there. And what you'll need to do is, after we press the bearing in, make sure we pull everything down, so tighten all those bolts down longitudinally, and then when you look through this hole, you'll see everything align, and that'll allow you to just knock that dowel in just with a 10mm bolt. Also, when you remove it, there'll be these funny, they're like a shim washer that sort of just sits on these lugs. There's one there and there's a smaller one for the other side. They obviously need to go on for installation. I'm going to put the casing over the top. I'm going to put all of the shift rods through the holes. And then I'm going to get a mirror, because this is obviously going to be up. And then I'm going to look underneath here and check that everything is aligned. Other things I need to look for is check that this is nicely aligned, because it's easy for the transmission casing to get caught on this. And I've found that once everything's in place, give it a bit of a jiggle and everything seems to settle in the right spot. And then once you can see that everything is in the right place, then we're going to pull this up and put that into the bearing. And with those 2 washers fitted there, those little metal ones, the thing sitting on its stand, I can now just go and put the casing straight over the top of it, put the shaft through that bearing, and then I might have to jiggle it a little bit to get past the output gear in the casing. And then I'm just going to check all the alignment of everything prior to putting this thing in. And then as we lower it down, and sometimes it might be a little bit easy with the second person, if those gear, if the shift rods aren't in place, but that's actually come down nicely into place. And it's all slotted down, and now what I'm going to do is check that everything's aligned. And once you put the casing on to start off with, you're happy that the alignment is all good. The next thing I'm going to do is put the park gear on there, put that circlip in, because that'll go in place quite happily now. Before I put any tools in here, I would be really careful of this face, because clearly that's a sealing face with the intermediate plate, and it must be kept as perfect as possible, so we don't want to damage that. I put a bunch of rags or something in there to make sure you protect it. When you initially put the casing over the top of the gear set, you'll jiggle it around to try and align everything. Sometimes it'll sit on top of the output shaft and the pinion shaft gears, which are the 2 big gears that sort of need to mesh. And if that's the case, just take a bit of the weight off here, grab hold of underneath here on the pinion shaft and twist it, and it'll just go clonk down into gear. And so to get this thing pull up in place. Now what do I need to do? Well, I need to pull up on the outer of the two shafts whilst holding the inner race of the bearing in place. So I'll show you the contraption that I've come up with. It actually works surprisingly well. I'm going to use a bearing puller, which is going to grapple around this, and that's what I'm going to be pulling up with, whilst another thing straddles that, a tool that I've made up, which is going to be holding down on the bearing race. When you're pulling this up and I've got a tool that's holding down on the bearing race, make sure this is centralized, because there's a lip on the shaft that will hit the underside of this if it's not centralized, if it's like that rather than perfectly central. So when you're setting this up, make sure you have it looking like that. So this is the tool that I'm using. The shaft itself is 40 millimeters outside diameter, so I've got a 42 millimeter inside diameter pipe. There's that, which looks pretty nasty because I don't have big industrial tools to cut big holes, but it's going to straddle around and push down on that. There's a couple of holes there which are going to hold onto some pins here that come from this. And I don't have rags and stuff here just so you can see what's going on. But what's going to happen is that I'm going to tighten here on my bearing removal tool. I've got some bits of M12 high tensile bar that are bolted to a couple of pieces of L section, and that's the thing that the bearing puller is pulling down on. So this is pushing down on the bits underneath, and this is pulling up on the bearing puller. When I start pulling this up, I'm going to move it a little bit and check that everything's being aligned correctly on the underside, because I don't want to break anything under there. But then once it gets going and everything's in the right spot, I can then just motor the thing up and pull it into place. So it's starting to pull it up. I'm now going to go and check underneath, check that everything is being pulled up correctly, which it looks like it is. And if it feels like it's starting to bind, obviously stop and find out what's going on. But this should just pull up relatively easily. Now it looks like my little tool down the bottom there has got out of alignment a little bit. So I'm just going to adjust that. I think it was catching on that lip. There we go, and it's pulled it fully up into place. This is that lip there that you need to keep the tool clear of, so it needs to be kept out here. The groove for the circlip is underneath there. What I've found is that even though I feel like I'll pull that all the way up, when I put the circlip on, it won't go into the groove. So what I do is I fit it as far down, push it down with a screwdriver as far as it will go, and then fit the tools again and apply pressure exactly as we did before, and then it'll just click it into place. Once you get it like this with the circlip, I've obviously not put the circlip in there, but once it's installed, you'll need to install the cylinders for the selector rods. Everything down the bottom with the bushes that hold these things isn't perfectly aligned yet because we haven't screwed everything from the other side. So what I would do is I'd flip it up the other way, tighten down all those two support structures, all those screws that hold that in place, and then come up to this side again and put these in place. Once you've got the gear set pressed into the bearing on the other side and you've got that circlip in place, these, because of the flex or the ability of these to move up and down a little bit, they still won't be all the way seated home. I find the easiest way to do this is just get a piece of timber and a mallet and just sort of gently tap on those where those screw connections are, just to put those nicely in place. Also where that dowel is going to go here, you can just stick it down in there, just give it a bit of a gentle tap, and you can easily look in there to see if everything's aligned, as well as all the screw holes around the side. And then once everything is in place, then you can go and put all those screws in. Once you've got most of those screws in, there'll be this one here that needs to go in, which is part of the idler gear for reverse. I would advise not trying to put this in earlier, because until you get everything aligned correctly, the clearances are fairly tight on this gear and it doesn't want to go in. So when you put it in, I just have the screw on the top, just holding it on there, have it all the way out, make sure the orientation of this is correct. Then you slot that into place. That'll just nicely go down, and you can find the hole, and then that one can be removed. We're going to put that in obviously when we put the rear cover on. Once I get to this stage here and everything is now tightened down, and I've got the idler gear in place. I'm going to put my stand on that, flip it over, put all the cylinders and pistons on for the ends of the gear. And the way we'll do that is the O-ring that is at the front there, I'm going to go and put that in that slot and just fit that into place. Then I'm going to push the cylinder all the way down and put that down, but just make sure you've got that in place. And then with the O-ring there already installed, I find that if you put these in and twist, they generally go in pretty well, and then they just push all the way down. The top two will just go to flush. The other two need to have these baffles put on the other side, and pushing them all the way down, probably another good centimetre or so, is a little bit hard by hand. So I push them down so they're flush, and then I just find a big socket that fits over here, and then just gently push those down, and I'll push those all the way down into the correct spot. And then for piston install, once that's all the way in there, I can just put that on there, and I can just move that as required to slot that all the way down. I'm going to push it all the way home down onto that, and then I'm going to put my screw in. There isn't an O-ring there, but I would obviously have that on there. Install that. That's an M8 fine, so an M8 by 1 screw. And that is going into steel, and that is an 8.8. So I'm not sure what torque I would use on that. I'd probably use 22 Newton meters, because I think that's still the same spec for an M8 regardless of the thread pitch.